It happened on a Tuesday over a bowl of half-eaten oatmeal, in a kitchen bigger than the entire apartment Naomi Carter used to call home. 6-year-old Ivy Sable looked up from her cereal, syrup still on her chin, and said the word so plainly, so naturally, that for a full 3 seconds nobody in that kitchen moved at all. "Can I have more milk, Mom?" Naomi's spoon stopped halfway to her own bowl. She looked up, certain the girl must be talking to someone else, certain there was another woman standing behind her that she simply hadn't noticed. There wasn't. Ivy was looking directly at her, waiting, milk carton already tipped slightly in her small hand, completely unaware that she had just said something that would change the next 6 months of both their lives. Naomi had been working in that house for exactly 11 weeks. She had no idea, pouring that milk with hands that were suddenly inexplicably unsteady, that the word Mom had not slipped out by accident. She had no idea that Ivy Sable had been quietly, deliberately practicing saying it under her breath for nearly 2 weeks, testing how it felt in her mouth before she ever dared to let it out loud. And she had absolutely no idea that somewhere down the hall, standing frozen in the doorway with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, Ivy's father, Desmond Sable, had heard every word of it. This is the story of a woman who took a caregiving job to survive, a little girl who was quietly starving for something money could never buy her, and the 6 months it took for an entire broken household to finally learn how to become a family again. Naomi Carter had grown up in Baltimore, the oldest of 3, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night, and a father who worked construction until his knees gave out and the work dried up along with it. She'd studied early childhood education at community college, 2 classes at a time, paying as she went, working the front desk of a daycare center during the day and taking her own classes in the evenings, certain in the specific stubborn way of someone raised to believe in slow, steady progress that she was building towards something. She married young at 23, to a man named Curtis who worked warehouse logistics and made her laugh in a way that felt, at the time, like it might be enough to build an entire life around. Their son Malik was born 2 years later, a small, serious baby who grew into a watchful, gentle little boy who noticed everything and said very little. Exactly the kind of child who made Naomi understand, on a cellular level, why her own mother had worked nights for years just to make sure her children never went without. Curtis left when Malik was 4, not dramatically, not with any single explosive moment Naomi could point to as the precise beginning of the end, but slowly, the way water erodes stone, one missed dinner and one canceled weekend at a time, until one day he simply didn't come home from a trip he claimed was for work and never fully explained himself afterward. He sent money sporadically for the first year. By the second, the checks stopped coming altogether, and Naomi found herself at 29, raising a 5-year-old alone on an early childhood educator's salary in a city where rent climbed faster than her paychecks ever could. She had no idea, during those exhausting years of double shifts at the daycare center and second jobs babysitting on weekends, that a specific, seemingly ordinary decision to answer a private staffing agency's listing for a live-in childcare position was about to place her directly inside the orbit of a household even more broken, in its own quiet way, than the one she was struggling to hold together herself. The listing had been vague by design, Naomi would later learn. A private household in the northern suburbs, seeking an experienced, patient caregiver for a 6-year-old girl, live-in preferred, salary generous enough that Naomi had read the number twice, certain it must be a typo. The agency coordinator, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Odette, had been unusually careful during the interview process, asking Naomi detailed questions not just about her childcare credentials but about her own emotional resilience, her patience with grief, her comfort working in a household that she described, cryptically, as still finding its footing. "The family has been through a difficult year," Odette told her, during their final interview, choosing her words with obvious care. "The mother of the household passed away 18 months ago. The father is a good man by every account, but he's struggling. And the little girl Ivy, she's a sweet child, but she's been through more losses in her short life than most adults have to process in decades." Naomi had no idea, sitting across from Odette in that quiet agency office, exactly how much weight was folded into that careful clinical phrase. More losses than most adults have to process. She would learn slowly, over her first weeks in the Sable household, that Ivy's mother, a woman named Priya Sable, hadn't simply died once in the way grief usually happens. She had died slowly, over nearly 2 years, of an aggressive cancer that had first gone into remission and given the family a brief, cruel window of hope, only to return and take her permanently just before Ivy's 5th birthday. Desmond Sable had built his fortune in commercial real estate development over nearly 2 decades, the kind of quiet, unglamorous wealth that didn't come with tabloid coverage or splashy public profiles, simply steady, compounding success that had eventually made him one of the wealthier men in a city that didn't particularly care to advertise its wealthiest residents. Before Priya's diagnosis, colleagues had described him, according to the little Naomi eventually pieced together from staff who'd worked there longer, as ambitious but warm, the kind of boss who remembered his employees' children's names and personally called clients on their birthdays. The man Naomi met on her first day in that house bore almost no resemblance to that description. Desmond Sable had become, in the 18 months since his wife's death, a person who moved through his own home like a guest who wasn't entirely sure he still belonged there. He worked constantly, often disappearing into his home office before Ivy woke and emerging long after she'd gone to bed, a pattern Naomi recognized almost immediately, from her own years of watching grieving parents at the daycare center, as a very specific, very common form of avoidance. It is considerably easier to build spreadsheets than it is to sit across a breakfast table from a 6-year-old who has your late wife's exact same eyes. Naomi had no idea, walking into that enormous, quiet house on her first day of work, carrying one suitcase and a folder of childcare certifications, that the little girl waiting nervously by the front window, watching every car that came up the driveway, had already lost 3 separate nannies in the 18 months since her mother's death, each one leaving for reasons the household staff described only vaguely, and that Ivy had, somewhere in that pattern of departures, quietly decided it was safer not to get attached to anyone new at all. The first 2 weeks were, by design and by Ivy's own quiet resistance, almost entirely wordless. Ivy was polite in the careful, over-formal way of a child who has learned that adults come and go and that emotional distance is the safest possible strategy. She ate her meals, completed her homework, said please and thank you with a precision that struck Naomi as almost unbearably sad in a 6-year-old, and retreated to her room the moment each obligation was finished, offering nothing extra, nothing unguarded, nothing that might give a new caregiver anything real to hold on to before she, too, inevitably left. Naomi recognized the pattern instantly, and rather than pushing against it, the way she suspected the previous nannies might have, tried too hard, moved too fast, she simply matched Ivy's pace. She didn't ask probing questions about Ivy's mother. She didn't try to fill the silences with cheerful chatter, the way some caregivers instinctively do when a child seems sad. She simply showed up, consistently, quietly, day after day, doing the small, unglamorous work of being present without demanding anything back. She had no idea, during those first careful weeks of near silence, that Ivy was watching her far more closely than she let on, cataloging, in the specific hypervigilant way grieving children often do, every small signal of whether this particular adult was likely to be another temporary fixture or something that might actually last. The first crack in Ivy's careful distance came on Naomi's 12th day, during an afternoon thunderstorm that knocked the power out across most of the neighborhood. Ivy, who had been playing quietly with a set of colored pencils at the kitchen table, suddenly went rigid at the first crash of thunder, her small hands gripping the table's edge, her breathing turning shallow and fast in a way that told Naomi, with the immediate practiced clarity of someone who'd spent a decade working with young children, that this wasn't ordinary storm-related fear. This was something considerably deeper. Ivy, Naomi said softly, kneeling down beside the girl's chair rather than reaching for her, careful not to crowd a child who'd spent 18 months learning that even comfort could feel like one more thing that might disappear. Can you tell me what's happening in your body right now? Ivy's eyes, wide and glassy, finally focused on Naomi's face. Mommy died during a storm, she whispered, the words coming out small and flat, the particular, disorienting flatness children sometimes use when describing something too enormous to feel fully in the moment. The lights went out at the hospital, and then everyone was crying, and then she was gone. Naomi had no idea, in that moment, exactly how much weight that single quiet sentence carried, or how carefully Ivy had apparently been guarding it for 18 months, waiting, perhaps without even fully understanding she was waiting, for someone patient enough to be trusted with it. That sounds like one of the scariest things that's ever happened to you, Naomi said gently, staying low, staying still, letting Ivy set the pace of whatever came next. I'm so sorry that happened, Ivy. Storms can bring back scary memories, even when we're somewhere safe now. Ivy studied her for a long moment, the particular searching look of a child deciding whether an adult can be trusted with something fragile. Then slowly she slid off her chair and without a word, climbed into Naomi's lap, pressing her face against Naomi's shoulder while the thunder continued to roll outside. They stayed like that for nearly 20 minutes, Naomi rocking gently, humming softly, saying nothing at all, until the storm passed and Ivy's breathing finally slowed back to normal. Naomi had no idea, in that quiet, unremarkable moment on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, that it had just become the exact foundation everything else between them would eventually be built on top of. Desmond Sable came home earlier than usual that particular evening, having left an important meeting the moment the storm knocked out power across the district, driven by an anxious, half-acknowledged worry about his daughter that he rarely let himself examine too closely. He found Naomi and Ivy in the den, Ivy curled against Naomi's side on the couch, the two of them quietly working through a picture book by flashlight while the power remained out. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, unnoticed by either of them, watching his daughter laugh softly at something Naomi had said. A genuine, unguarded laugh he hadn't heard from Ivy in longer than he wanted to admit. He had no idea, standing there in that darkened doorway, exactly how much that ordinary, unremarkable scene was about to unsettle something he'd been carefully avoiding examining in himself for the better part of 2 years. "Everything all right in here?" he finally asked, his voice carrying a rough, uncertain quality Naomi hadn't heard from him before, in the brief, mostly formal interactions they'd had during her first 2 weeks in the house. "We're fine," Naomi said, keeping her tone light for Ivy's sake. The storm scared her a little, but we're doing okay now, aren't we, Ivy? Ivy nodded against Naomi's side, not lifting her head, apparently unwilling to break whatever fragile comfort she'd found. Desmond watched them for another long moment, something complicated moving across his face, before he simply nodded and retreated back toward his office, leaving Naomi with the distinct, uneasy impression that she'd witnessed something he hadn't meant for her to see, though she couldn't yet articulate exactly what that something was. She had no idea that evening that Desmond Sable had spent the following 3 hours in his office not working at all, but sitting motionless at his desk, staring at nothing, turning over the specific, unsettling question of when exactly he had last made his own daughter laugh that easily, and coming up, to his own considerable shame, with an answer measured not in weeks but in months. The weeks that followed brought a slow, careful thaw between Naomi and Ivy, the particular, unhurried kind of trust-building that Naomi had learned, over a decade of working with grieving and anxious children, could never be rushed without risking real damage. Ivy began seeking Naomi out unprompted, first with small questions, then with small confidences, eventually with the easy, constant chatter of a child who has finally decided a particular adult is safe enough to fully be herself around. She told Naomi about her mother in fragments, the way children often process loss. Not in tidy, linear stories but in scattered, precious details that surfaced at unexpected moments. Her mother had loved gardening, apparently, and the enormous, overgrown flower beds along the side of the house, Naomi learned, had been meticulously tended by Priya before her illness and had simply been left to grow wild in the years since, because nobody in the household had known what else to do with a garden that had belonged so completely to someone who was gone. "Daddy doesn't go out there anymore," Ivy told Naomi one afternoon, the two of them standing at the edge of the overgrown beds, weeds now nearly waist-high on Ivy. "He used to help her plant the tulips every spring. Now he just walks past really fast and doesn't look at it." Naomi had no idea, standing beside that overgrown garden with a 6-year-old small hand in hers, that this specific, unremarkable observation was about to plant an idea in her mind that would eventually become one of the most significant turning points in the entire household's slow, difficult healing. She began, gradually and without asking anyone's permission, tending small corners of that garden during Ivy's nap times and after her bedtime, pulling weeds, clearing overgrowth, not attempting anything dramatic or transformative, simply returning small pieces of it to something recognizable. She didn't mention it to Desmond. She told herself in the beginning that it was simply something quiet and meditative to do with her own hands during the long, solitary evening hours of a live-in job, but she understood, somewhere underneath that explanation, that she was doing it for Ivy, and perhaps in some way she wasn't yet ready to fully examine for Desmond too. Desmond, for his part, remained a distant, largely absent presence during those first 2 months, though Naomi began noticing small shifts she hadn't expected. He started coming home slightly earlier some evenings, lingering in doorways to watch Ivy's homework sessions or bedtime routines before retreating to his office rather than disappearing entirely. He asked Naomi occasional, careful questions about Ivy's day, questions that revealed in their specificity a father paying closer attention than his physical absence might have suggested. "She mentioned you helped her with a school project about the ocean," he said one evening, catching Naomi in the kitchen after Ivy had gone to sleep. "She was still talking about it at breakfast. I don't think I've heard her that excited about schoolwork in a long time. She's a bright kid," Naomi said simply, cautious about overstepping into territory that felt, even after 2 months, still delicately balanced. She just needed someone to be curious with her about it. Desmond nodded slowly, something unreadable moving across his face. "I used to be that person," he said quietly, more to himself than to Naomi, before catching himself and retreating, as he so often did, back toward the safety of his office and the work that let him avoid sitting too long with feelings he didn't yet know how to hold. Naomi had no idea, watching him disappear down that hallway, exactly how much guilt was tangled up in that quiet, half-finished sentence, or how directly it connected to a promise Desmond had made to his dying wife that he had, in the 18 months since her death, felt himself failing to keep more completely with every passing week. Ivy Sable, in the final weeks of her illness, had made her husband promise something specific, something he had carried like a stone in his chest ever since. She had asked him, holding his hand in a hospital bed with a directness that grief and clarity sometimes bring together, to make sure Ivy never stopped believing the world was full of people worth trusting, worth loving, worth letting in, even after losing the one person she trusted most completely. Desmond had promised, and then in the disorienting, grief-numbed months that followed, had done almost the exact opposite, retreating into work, into emotional distance, into a carefully maintained routine that kept him from having to feel the full weight of a promise he genuinely did not know how to keep. He had watched 3 nannies come and go in 18 months, had watched his daughter grow more guarded with each departure, and had told himself in the specific self-protective logic of someone avoiding a harder truth, that Ivy simply needed time, that things would improve on their own eventually, without ever quite admitting that his own withdrawal was very possibly the single largest obstacle standing in the way of exactly the healing Priya had asked him to protect. He had no idea, watching Naomi Carter slowly, patiently rebuild something real with his daughter over those first 2 months, that her quiet, unhurried presence in his household was about to become the exact catalyst that finally forced him to confront everything he'd been avoiding. The moment that changed everything, the moment that would eventually lead to that ordinary Tuesday breakfast 11 weeks later, arrived on a Saturday afternoon roughly 2 months into Naomi's employment, when Ivy, working alongside Naomi in the partially restored garden, suddenly stopped pulling weeds and looked up with an expression of quiet, searching seriousness that seemed considerably older than her 6 years. "Are you going to leave like the other ones did?" she asked, the question arriving with no warning at all, the particular, disarming directness of a child who has decided, after careful consideration, that the moment for honesty has finally come. Naomi set down the small trowel in her hand and gave the question the full, careful weight it deserved. "I don't know exactly how long I'll be working here, Ivy," she said honestly, refusing. The easy, comforting lie that might have felt kinder in the moment but would have ultimately cost far more. "Jobs change sometimes for all sorts of reasons that don't have anything to do with how much someone cares about you. But I can promise you this. For as long as I am here, I am going to show up every single day exactly the way I have been. And if the day ever comes that I have to leave, I will tell you the truth about it, and I will make sure you know it was never, ever because of anything you did." Ivy considered this answer with the same careful, searching seriousness she seemed to bring to most things, then nodded slowly, apparently satisfied, at least for the moment, with an answer that hadn't tried to promise her something impossible. "The others just left," she said quietly. "Nobody explained anything. One day they were just gone, and Daddy said it wasn't my fault, but he says a lot of stuff isn't my fault and I don't always believe him." Naomi had no idea, kneeling in that half-restored garden with a trowel in her hand and a 6-year-old's careful, guarded heart laid bare in front of her, that Desmond Sable was standing just inside the kitchen door, close enough to hear every word, close enough that Naomi's honest, unguarded answer to his daughter's most painful question landed on him with a force considerably heavier than anything he'd expected from an ordinary Saturday afternoon. He didn't reveal himself in that moment. He simply stood there, absorbing it, understanding for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit exactly how much damage his own emotional absence had likely contributed to Ivy's guardedness, and understanding too, with a clarity that felt almost physically uncomfortable, exactly how differently this particular caregiver seemed to be handling his daughter's grief than he himself had managed to over the previous 18 months. That evening, once Ivy had gone to bed, Desmond found Naomi in the kitchen and asked, for the first time since her hiring, if she had a few minutes to talk. "I heard what you told her in the garden today," he admitted, sitting across from her at the kitchen island, his usual composed, businesslike demeanor noticeably absent. "About staying honest with her. About not making promises you can't keep." Naomi felt a flicker of concern, uncertain whether she'd overstepped some boundary she hadn't fully understood. "I hope that was all right. I try to always be honest with the kids I work with, even when it's harder than telling them what they want to hear." "It was more than all right," Desmond said quietly. "It was considerably more honest than I've managed to be with her since Priya died." He paused, visibly working to find the right words for something he'd apparently been carrying for a long time without saying out loud to anyone. "I made her mother a promise. To keep Ivy open, keep her trusting, keep her believing people are worth loving even after loss. And I've spent 18 months breaking that promise a little more every single day, because it was easier to bury myself in work than to sit across from my own daughter and see how much she looks like her mother." Naomi said nothing for a moment, giving the confession the space it needed rather than rushing to fill the silence. "Grief doesn't usually follow a schedule," she finally said gently. "But Ivy needs you present, Mr. Sable. Not perfect, just present. She notices when you're not, more than I think you realize." Desmond nodded slowly, something shifting visibly in his expression, the specific, quiet look of a man finally allowing himself to fully absorb a truth he'd been circling for a long time without letting it land. "I'd like to try to do better," he said. "I'm not entirely sure how, but I'd like to try." Naomi had no idea, in that quiet kitchen conversation, that this single, honest admission was about to begin a slow, deliberate shift in Desmond Sable's daily habits, one that would unfold gradually over the following weeks in small, unremarkable ways that nonetheless added up to something considerably larger than either of them fully anticipated at the time. Over the following month, Desmond began coming home earlier, consistently, several evenings a week, initially awkward and uncertain about how to reinsert himself into routines Naomi had spent 2 months carefully building with Ivy, but gradually, visibly more comfortable with each attempt. He started helping with Ivy's bedtime stories again, a ritual Naomi learned in passing conversation, that he and Priya had shared every night before her illness and that he had, without ever quite deciding to, simply stopped doing after her death because it hurt too much to sit in Ivy's room without her mother there. He began, tentatively at first, joining Naomi and Ivy in the garden on weekend afternoons, pulling weeds alongside them in a silence that gradually, week by week, filled with small, careful conversation. Naomi watched him relearn, slowly and with visible effort, how to simply be present with his daughter without the specific ache of comparison to what they'd lost overwhelming every moment they spent together. She had no idea, during those weeks of careful incremental progress, exactly how much her own quiet consistency, the same patient unhurried presence she'd offered Ivy from the very beginning, was becoming something Desmond Sable had started to depend on as well, not in any way he was fully prepared to name yet, but in the specific, undeniable way a person begins to notice when someone's presence in a room changes the entire feeling of the space. By her 10th week in the household, Naomi had become, without either of them explicitly deciding it, considerably more than an employee. She ate dinner with the family most evenings now, at Ivy's insistent request and Desmond's quiet encouragement. She had opinions solicited on decisions large and small, from Ivy's school activities to, eventually, small household matters Desmond found himself increasingly asking her thoughts on, decisions that had nothing directly to do with childcare at all. She had no idea, settling into that slowly expanding role within the household, that Ivy had, somewhere during those 10 weeks, quietly begun testing out, in the private, careful way children sometimes rehearse things before risking them out loud, exactly what it might feel like to call this particular adult by a word she hadn't allowed herself to use with anyone since her mother's death. The Tuesday it finally happened arrived like any other morning. Sunlight coming through the kitchen. Windows, Ivy in her school uniform working through a bowl of oatmeal while Naomi packed her lunch for the day. Desmond had come down earlier than usual, coffee in hand, standing quietly in the doorway rather than immediately retreating toward his office, a small but significant shift that had become increasingly common over recent weeks. And then reaching for the milk carton with the easy, unself-conscious naturalness of a child who has finally fully decided something in her own heart, Ivy looked up and asked for more milk, and called Naomi Mom, as though she'd been saying it every single day of her life. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt, to both adults in that kitchen, considerably longer. Naomi poured the milk with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady, uncertain whether to acknowledge the word directly or let the moment pass without comment, terrified, in the space of those few seconds, of somehow getting the response wrong in a way that might hurt a child who had clearly, carefully decided to offer her something enormous. Desmond, still standing in the doorway, felt something crack open in his chest that he hadn't fully prepared himself for. A complicated tangle of emotions he would spend the following days trying to fully untangle. Grief first, sharp and immediate, at hearing a word that had belonged so completely to Priya now directed at someone else. But underneath that grief, something else entirely, something that felt, to his own considerable surprise, almost like relief, watching his daughter reach so naturally and so happily toward a word she had apparently been afraid, for 18 long months, that she might never get to use again. Naomi finally set the milk carton down and knelt beside Ivy's chair, choosing her words with the same careful honesty she brought to every difficult moment with this child over the past 11 weeks. "Ivy," she said gently, "I want you to know how much it means to me that you feel that way about me. But I think that's a really big, important word, and I want to make sure we talk about it together, all three of us, so nobody feels confused or hurt by it. Is that okay?" Ivy's face flickered briefly with uncertainty, the particular, familiar fear of a child worried she said something wrong. "Did I do a bad thing?" "No, sweetheart," Naomi said immediately, pulling her into a gentle hug. "You didn't do anything bad at all. You did something brave. I just want us to talk about it honestly, the way we always tried to do." She had no idea, in that careful, tender moment, that Desmond had already quietly stepped back from the doorway, needing a few minutes alone to process everything he'd just witnessed before he felt ready to join the conversation Naomi had just promised his daughter. That evening, after Ivy had gone to bed, Desmond found Naomi in the kitchen, the same place their most honest conversations always seemed to happen. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely uncertain of how to begin. "I need to talk to you about this morning," he said, sitting down across from her, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he wasn't actually drinking. "I heard what she called you." Naomi felt her stomach tighten with anxiety, uncertain what direction this conversation might take. "I want you to know I never encouraged that, Mr. Sable. I've been very careful never to overstep my role in this house. I don't know exactly why she said it this morning, but I promise you it wasn't something I know," Desmond interrupted gently, his tone considerably softer than the words themselves might have suggested. "I know you didn't encourage it. That's not why I wanted to talk to you." He paused, gathering his thoughts with visible effort. "I think I've spent so long being afraid of watching Ivy attached to someone new, afraid of watching her lose someone else the way she lost her mother, that I never let myself really look at what's actually been happening in this house over the past 11 weeks. "And what's that?" Naomi asked carefully. "You've been keeping a promise I made to my wife and completely failed to keep myself," Desmond said, his voice rough with an emotion he was visibly working to control. "You've kept Ivy open, kept her trusting, kept her believing people are worth loving even after everything she's lost. I was so afraid of watching her get hurt again that I nearly let her stay closed off forever, and you've spent almost 3 months quietly, patiently, undoing exactly the damage I was too scared to even acknowledge I was causing." Naomi felt tears gathering, unexpected and difficult to hold back. "I care about her very much," she admitted quietly. "I care about both of you actually more than I probably should as an employee. I've tried very hard to keep appropriate boundaries, but I won't pretend this hasn't become considerably more than a job to me." Desmond looked at her for a long moment, something shifting visibly in his expression, a specific, careful vulnerability he clearly wasn't accustomed to showing anyone. "I don't want you to worry about boundaries tonight," he said quietly. "I want to ask you something honestly. And I want you to feel completely free to say no. Is there a version of this, of all of this, that could become something more permanent? Not just employment. A real family built honestly, built slowly, at whatever pace feels right to all three of us. Naomi sat with the question for a long moment, feeling the full weight of everything it carried, not just for herself, but for a little boy of her own back home who had, over the past 11 weeks, spent every weekend visiting a mansion he'd started, quietly and without prompting, referring to as the other house, and for a grieving father finally hesitantly reaching toward something he'd spent 18 months too afraid to want. I think, she finally said, that if we're honest with each other and honest with Ivy and honest with my son Malik and we take this slowly, one real day at a time instead of rushing toward some idea of a perfect ending, then yes. I think there might be something worth building here. The months that followed unfolded with the same careful, deliberate honesty that had defined every meaningful moment of Naomi's time in that household from the very beginning. Malik, initially uncertain and a little overwhelmed by the size and unfamiliarity of the Sable estate, gradually formed his own quiet, steady friendship with Ivy, the two of them eventually inseparable during weekend visits, bonding over the specific shared experience of loss and the specific shared relief of finally slowly learning to trust again. Desmond kept his renewed commitment to presence, showing up for school events, bedtime stories, and ordinary weeknight dinners with a consistency that gradually, visibly, transformed the entire feeling of that once silent house. He returned, eventually, to the overgrown garden alongside Priya's flower beds, not to erase his late wife's memory, but to honor it, planting tulips again the following spring with Ivy at his side, teaching her, the way he'd once promised Priya he would, exactly which bulbs to plant and how deep. Naomi never stopped being careful about the pace of everything. Never let the household rush toward labels or promises before they genuinely earned them through months of honest, patient, unglamorous effort. But by the time a full year had passed since that ordinary Tuesday breakfast, Ivy no longer practiced the word mom under her breath before daring to say it out loud. She simply said it, easily, happily, dozens of times a day, and Naomi, who had once knelt beside a kitchen chair uncertain how to respond to a word so enormous, had learned slowly and carefully exactly how to hold it. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Naomi was right to be so careful about the word mom? Or should she have simply let Ivy claim it from the very first day? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're telling the story of a hospice nurse who spent the final 6 months of a stranger's life keeping a promise she never expected to make, and the family that showed up afterward to make sure she never had to keep it alone.